Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Mackenzie, and I'm a senior member of the WIL program.
And I'm Kim Dean. I'm a junior in the WIL program.
I have a sister, and she is such a part of me. I remember the day she was born because I was there. I was 10 years old. I never had had a brother or sister, and her birth was the most momentous experience in my life. I have a sister. She is now 10 years old. She is the same age I was when she was born. I have a sister, and she now begins her adolescence.
In the words of Dr. Mary Pipher, girls are coming of age in a more dangerous, sexualized, and media-saturated culture. As they navigate a more dangerous world, girls are less protected. The dangers young women face today can jeopardize their future. It is critical that we understand the circumstances and take measures to correct.
I have a sister. She has sparkling green eyes that are windows to her soul. They glisten when she laughs and well up with tears when she feels threatened. She is like me, and she is not like me. She has a giggle, she has a temper. I think she's beautiful. She doesn't think she's beautiful.
A study commissioned by the American Association of University Women said, quote, "Adolescence is a tough time for both girls and boys. As girls and boys grow older, both experience significant loss of self-esteem in a variety of areas. However, the loss is most dramatic and has the most long-lasting effect on girls."
She has friends. One day they like her, and one day they don't. She has boys in her class. Many are foolish boys, awkward and careless in their words, but frighteningly powerful in their impact. She has a mother and father who love her, but who have become frustrated and tired after all of the fighting. I have a sister. And she has a sister who loves her, but who is concerned, who's scared. A sister that won't stand by and let my precious sister struggle alone. I have a sister whose self-esteem is my daily prayer. We are all starting to realize the breadth of this problem. Having the educational opportunity to read about, to think about, and discuss the cultural factors that affect women is the most important aspect of the Women Involved in Living and Learning program, which is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year. Through our experiences in WIL, we are able to see the importance of bringing Dr. Mary Pipher to the University of Richmond to discuss with all of us the need to address the difficulties facing young women today.
Also helping to create this opportunity are the following: West Hampton College Residence Life, St. Catherine's School, Women's Studies, Cultural Affairs, Voice, the Media Resource Center, Residence Hall Association, and WCGA. Thank you all for your support. We would also like to thank Pat Isaacs, who will be interpreting this evening's program. Dr. Mary Pipher is a clinical psychologist in private practice with her Bachelor of Arts in Cultural Anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley and her PhD from the University of Nebraska. Her special area of interest is how American culture affects the mental health of its women. Esteemed author of Hunger Pains, The American Women's Tragic Quest for Thinness, and Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls, Dr. Pipher is here tonight to help us help females survive life in the hurricane. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mary Pipher.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back row? Excellent. I've never been to Virginia before today, and really all I've seen is this campus, but it's a very beautiful state. I walked around the little lake tonight and saw a raccoon chasing a goose, so I'm sort of impressed by that. I'd like to thank West Hampton College and Richmond University for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm very honored to be part of the WIL program's 15th anniversary celebration. I read about WIL on the airplane today coming to Richmond, and it's a very unique program. I think you're very lucky to have this program in your state. I don't think there's a program like it in the country, and I can tell from meeting with some of the young women involved in the program, that it's having the effect the founders desired, which is to produce bold, assertive, confident, intellectually interesting young women. I particularly want to thank Holly Blake, who's been my host for today and who is an extremely good host. I looked over the list of other speakers brought by Will, including Maya Angelou and Naomi Wolf and Sweet Honey in the Rock, Cornell West, who shares an editor with me, and I'm very honored to be in the company of such a list. So thank you again for inviting me. I'm a therapist in private practice in Lincoln, and the book I wrote, Reviving Ophelia, is my attempt to make sense of my experiences with adolescent girls, particularly in about the last 5 years. My office has been swamped with girls coming in with a variety of very serious problems: eating disorders, alcoholism, depression, school refusers, sexual problems, and many other angry and self-destructive behaviors. As I saw this parade of girls coming into my office, I started asking, why are so many young women in pain? What should I do about this fact? And also, what is it that I can do not to make a difference one girl at a time, but to attack the problem in a little bit more global way? Now, here's where my background in anthropology ended up coming in handy, because what I really started thinking about is, how is the culture affecting the young women I'm seeing today? And as you'll see as I talk, I'm not such a believer in the dysfunctional family theory as a way to explain adolescent problems. I'm much more a believer that we have at this point in time a very dysfunctional culture for teenagers. So I wrote Reviving Ophelia. Now, Ophelia, as you know, is from Hamlet, and I chose the title because I think Shakespeare's Ophelia is a very good metaphor for the experiences of early adolescent girls. Ophelia is a beautiful young girl who's quite emotionally sturdy until she falls in love with Hamlet. She's torn between her father and her lover, Hamlet, gets very confused about what she should do, eventually goes crazy, hurls herself in a stream, and because she has such a heavy silk dress, she's weighted down by her long hair and her beautiful gown and drowns in this stream. Now, just parenthetically, it's very interesting how throughout the history of literature, this image of young women in drowning comes up over and over again. And I didn't realize when I chose it how many other writers had come upon the same image of water when they discuss young women. When I first worked with adolescent girls, I relied on my experiences as a teenager to understand their experiences. And using my 30-year-old pictures of adolescence, I was very lost. Gradually, I came to understand that the lives of girls today are radically different than was my life as a girl in the late 50s and early 60s. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about my life, and I think you will agree that times have changed. I grew up in a town of 420 people in western Nebraska, Beaver City, Nebraska. It was built on a town square, and in the square, old men sat, and they passed out pennies and licorice to kids when we walked across that square. And I knew every person and every dog that I encountered when I walked across the square. I knew all the owners of the stores and signed for my purchases. I never used money, actually. When I go back to my town today with my children, they think it's just ridiculous, because I'll go in to, say, buy a box of Kleenex, and I can't just go in and buy Kleenex. I have to have an extended conversation with the clerk about my 6 younger brothers and sisters and what they're doing, and about her children, and about my cousins, and about my school teacher who's now in a rest home, and so on and so on. And my children, on the other hand, shop in malls among strangers, and they don't know the clerks who sell them products. Garrison Keillor has a line that nobody gets rich in a small town because everybody's watching. And that was my experience as a kid. Nobody seemed to have a whole lot more money than anybody else. The banker's wife had air conditioning, but we let her get away with it because she had asthma. Otherwise, I don't think she would have dared have air conditioning. Now, one of the things about small towns was everybody knew what everybody was doing. And in fact, one time my brother Jake hung on the jungle gym at the school in a dangerous way. And I remember for weeks afterwards, wherever our family went, people had come up and tell my parents, "Did you notice Jake was hanging on the jungle gyms in a dangerous way?" And my brother just got so sick of it he could spit. He was so mad. But that's how small towns work. And in contrast, let me tell you about what happened to me not too long ago. I was driving from Lincoln, where I lived, to Omaha, along our Cornhusker Highway, our big highway on the north side of town. And I saw a little girl, probably about 5 years old. She was dressed in kind of a dull outfit, and it was raining hard so that she was almost invisible in this rain. She was standing by herself on a 6-lane highway, trying to cross it, probably to go to school. And I was immediately worried about her. She looked like she was kind of confused and didn't know how to cross the street properly. It was not a good day for anybody to be crossing this busy highway where people were going about 60 miles an hour. So immediately I was thinking, what should I do about this child? I thought, well, I can stop, but am I going to scare her? Is she going to run into the traffic thinking I'm, a child kidnapper or something like that? And then I also saw the headlines, clinical psychologist arrested for attempted abduction. I wasn't sure I could explain myself if she got scared. But so I was sort of pondering what was the right thing to do and which would be more dangerous for this little girl if I left her alone or got out of my car and tried to approach her. And another car stopped. And I thought, oh, thank goodness, some adult is going to help this little girl. And a man gets out. And I think, well, maybe he's an abductor. So it's a very complex moral universe at this point in terms of how does an adult go about helping a child? That's just one small example of how much the world has changed. My mom was a doctor, and my father sold hogs and hog feed. I was the oldest of 7 kids. We had lots of relatives who visited frequently and stayed often. Cousins came and spent the summer. I had grandparents who lived with me some of the time when I was a child. And in fact, my happiest memory as a kid is falling asleep to the sound of grown-ups laughing and playing cards in the next room. That was a very common experience for me. We didn't have the word media. Television was one snowy channel a few hours a day. The movie theater was owned by a man with a great sense of civic responsibility. He showed one movie every 2 weeks, a movie he carefully previewed to make sure it was suitable for families. The scariest movie he ever showed was The Blob, and I remember it just terrified me. Mostly it was biblical extravaganzas with Charleston Heston, Disney movies, Doris Day movies. My favorite all-time movie was Debbie Reynolds' film Tammy. I wanted her face and I wanted her life. I thought Tammy was so cool. Music was very bland. We listened to 45s by Bobby Vinton, Frankie Avalon, the Everly Brothers. Wake Up Little Susie was a very scandalous record in my town. And my parents would not let me buy Bobby Darin's record Multiplication because they thought it was far too sexually suggestive. There were no drugs and no alcohol sold in my town. In fact, we had about 8 churches and no place you could buy even a beer. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't drink, but they did their drinking for the most part out of sight of the children. And I remember the only time I had alcohol until I was in college. I went over to a friend of mine's house, and her dad had some Mogan David in the icebox. And we each decided we were going to drink. We poured ourselves tumblers, and we'd never seen anybody drunk before, but we each had about 3 sips and pretended we were drunk and fell on the floor giggling and tried to act like we thought drunk people would act. Since we'd never seen any, we had to ad lib it quite a bit. There were blue laws. There was a whistle that blew 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 at night to tell you when to get up and eat in case you forgot. Stores were closed on Sunday, and they were closed at 6 at night. There was no Playboy, there was no pornography. In fact, the sexiest magazine I ever encountered were these romances that one of my friend's cousins had under her bed, but you couldn't figure out what was going on from these magazines, because when the heroine and the hero kissed, the focus of the artist would turn to, you know, sunlight dappling on leaves or something like that, and you wouldn't really know what happened after that. In fact, it was very hard for kids to figure out what sex was exactly. Divorce was uncommon, and I didn't know anybody whose parents were divorced. The word was whispered like the word cancer. We played in wild places, we played outdoors. My dad raised pigeons. Us kids brought home baby coyotes that we bought from bounty hunters. We had rabbits that we kept and chickens. We had a cellar where we played war games. We played in fields. Babysitters were very rare, and kids biked everywhere. In my town, children were safe out of doors anywhere at all hours. We were not warned to be afraid of grown-ups. Keys were left in cars. There were no locks on the doors of many of the homes. I remember sitting in the city park late at night telling ghost stories. And we could scare the heck out of ourselves with ghost stories, but when I walked home, I was scared of ghosts, not of people. There was virtually no crime beyond bike theft. And in fact, I remember the first time that I read Children Could Die, and I was probably in about 3rd or 4th grade. A school burned down in Chicago, and maybe 100 children were killed. And I remember going up to my school and looking at the escape tunnel and thinking about that. I remember reading Diary of Anne Frank and realizing there were grown-ups out there who would hurt children, and just being stunned by that idea. Now, during my 8th grade year, Charles Starkweather roared across our state. And he was a mass murderer. He just absolutely scared the heck out of us. He stunned us. Because before Starkweather, we didn't even have the term mass murder. And there were many other words that weren't in our language, like shopping channel, MTV, computer, stalker, crack, herpes, HIV positive. Now, I don't want to overstate how blissful life was in small towns. As my son's girlfriend said recently, she's from a small town, she said, "I was fortunate to grow up in one, but I don't want to go back." I don't choose to live in a small town myself. I know they can be gossipy and intrusive. I know they can be cliquish and hypocritical. The 1950s, in addition, had anti-Semitism, racism, and women were awfully frustrated oftentimes by the roles they were assigned. We had a girl in my 8th grade class who just disappeared. In fact, she had just the week before she disappeared gotten the 8 years perfect attendance pin at MYF. And when she disappeared, I tried to find out what happened to her. I asked her friends, I asked my teachers, nobody would tell me. Finally, I was so upset about it that my mom told me. And this girl had gotten pregnant. Her father owned a store, and one of the male clerks in the store had been driving this girl home from school, and they'd had sexual relations, and she'd gotten pregnant. And they'd gotten married and moved to a trailer outside of town, and she was out of school, and we never saw her again. So there was definitely a downside to the 50s, and I remember it well. Another friend of mine's father killed himself. Nobody ever said a word about it. People were very quiet about problems sometimes. But what I would argue about the 50s and the experiences I had is that children were allowed to have a childhood. Most children were innocent in a way children cannot be now. And innocent derives from a Latin phrase, not having been hurt. Children had not been hurt the way children have been hurt today. Coming of age is much harder for children now. This isn't a matter of personal opinion. The National Center for Health Statistics documents this. In the last 20 years, there's been a 300% increase in adolescent suicide. Now, the overall suicide rate has gone up about 17%, but adolescents are a specifically very stressed population, and I want to talk a little tonight about why that is. There are many reasons why life is tougher. First of all, there's been an enormous loss of community all over America. Children grow up among strangers. When I was in Beaver City, probably about my 5th grade year, walking home from school, I stole some lilacs from this older lady's front yard. She was in her window, she saw me do it. She came out, she gave me an extremely hard time, told me that I was a thief, that my parents hadn't raised me properly, and so on. By the time I got home, she'd called my parents, given them a bad time. My dad was mad as can be at me. Weeks after that, wherever I'd go, people would say, well, we heard you stole lilacs from Mrs. Van Cleve's house. Now, I think she was crabby. I think she overreacted, but I never stole anything again in my life. And one of the changes now is that oftentimes when children behave badly, there's no adult around who knows their name, who can help them correct their behavior. Technology has eroded community. People who used to be sitting out on their front porches are inside watching TV instead of outside watching the children on the street. I read recently in our newspaper that soon we'll be able to shop for strawberries at our grocery store via computer, so we won't need to go to the store. And I think this will be a bad thing, because I think it's very important that people who live in an area know each other by name, speak to each other, and so on. We have now for children a new electronic community. We live in a global village connected by media. It's one big town. The average child spends more time watching television than they do anything else. They spend about 35 hours a week watching television. They spend 35 minutes alone with their fathers, 2.5 hours with their mothers. Children know Madonna, Beavis and Butthead better than they know their neighbors or their cousins. Video games, movies, music are our children's teachers. All television is educational. Children polled recently in California said that television encouraged them to be more sexual, aggressive, rude to their parents, and dishonest than they thought they would otherwise be. And I think they're absolutely right about this. Ads, 400 ads a day, are consumed by the average child. And these ads, I think, do an interesting job in terms of educating children. Children are educated to want products, to feel vaguely dissatisfied with what they have, to think products are important, and so on. Family life is much more fragmented than it was 30 years ago. Child abuse has increased, divorce has increased. You don't need to know the statistics from me, you've heard them many times. But I do just want to say something about grandparents. Grandparents are an undervalued resource in our culture at this point in time. I saw a boy in therapy. This boy was had shoplifted, and his mother was a single parent mother, a very good mother, but she worked about 50 hours a week, got home about 6:30 at night every night. So this boy gets out of school and he's on his own for 2 or 3 hours. And one day he'd gone into a Kmart and taken some stuff. When I met with this boy, I immediately liked him. And I thought, you know, there is nothing wrong with this boy that a grandfather couldn't cure. But his grandfather was 2,000 miles away, and he'd seen him twice in his lifetime. Children really are missing the opportunity to connect with extended family, with grandparents, with aunts and uncles. One of my editors in New York told me a very touching story about her daughter, and in fact the whole family had visited the summer before relatives in the South, in North Carolina. And they just stayed a few days. The other thing this girl had done, as many children do from New York City, is spend the summer at computer camp and ranch camp and tennis camp and wilderness camp and so on. So around January 1st, they're looking through all these camp brochures. And the girl is very apathetic about camp. And finally she says to her mother, "You know, I don't want to go to camp. I want to go spend the summer with my grandmother in North Carolina." This was the wife's husband's mother. So she was sort of taken aback by that, but she called up her mother-in-law, who she didn't really know very well. She'd met 2 or 3 times in her life, and told the mother-in-law what her daughter had said. And the mother-in-law said, "I would be honored. Have your daughter come spend the summer." And it was a very good summer. Among other things, this grandmother and granddaughter worked on building a trail on the grandmother's land, a hiking trail. And the section they built, they named in honor of this granddaughter, who was the first person to work on it with the grandmother. There's more alcohol and there's more drugs today. 40% of our college students in Lincoln get drunk every weekend. And most importantly, kids make decisions about their relationship to chemicals much younger. I made decisions about whether or not I drink and smoke pot when I was 18 and 19. I'm seeing kids 10 years old who are struggling with the decision of whether to smoke cigarettes, whether to drink, whether to take pills, and whether to be sexually active, for that matter. There's more guns and there's more danger. There are many more traumatized teenagers. Children are very fearful of being kidnapped in our community. In fact, we now have worry groups in our public schools, and children's number one fear is that they'll be kidnapped. 40% of the children in our schools think it's quite likely they will be kidnapped. Their number 2 fear is that they will lose both of their parents to a car accident or a plane crash or something like that. Now, when I thought about this trauma business was when my son was graduating from high school. And he said something about missing all the students in his class that weren't graduating. And I said, "Well, who are you talking about?" He counted the number of kids he'd known who died violently. Murder, gunshot, car accidents, and suicide. He knew a dozen kids that had died that way. When I graduated from high school, I knew a couple young women who died from cancer, no one who died violently. One of the things that happens a lot to me as a therapist is kids that are doing pretty well themselves come in because they're worried about their friends. And they have a friend who's pregnant, a friend who's been sexually assaulted, and so on. Basically, 7th graders just aren't ready for what they're facing. They're mentally not ready, their brains have not fully developed, their emotions are not well modulated. And as I put it in the book, girls who sleep with their stuffed unicorns are not ready for sexual pressure and offers of Zima, which is what they're getting in 7th grade. I want to talk just for a couple minutes about parents. In America, we place a great premium on independence. And one of the problems for us right now is that just at a time when our children most need help, in this culture, we socialize them to turn away from us. They turn away from parents, they turn to mass culture and to their peers for validation. So for example, a friend of mine told me a story about her family. She and her husband took their 2 sons to our state fair to see a group called the Crash Test Dummies. Do you have the Crash Test Dummies in Virginia? Anyway, after this show on a Saturday night, the family's walking along the midway. And Anders, the oldest boy, who's about 12, sees some of his friends. And he kind of pulls away from his parents. And the parents felt badly about this because they're a very close family and they have a very good time when they go out. And afterwards, they were kind of teasing him in the car on the way home. And he burst into tears. And he said, "You know, Mom and Dad, I really love to go places with you and we have a lot of fun. But my friends will not understand that. And I think for the next few years, I'd better not go out with you on a Saturday night. That's a very insightful kid to be able to put this all together and be that articulate about what happens, the kind of pressure children experience at about age 11, 12. I thought about this when I interviewed Vietnamese students for my book. I was talking to a young Vietnamese woman and I said, "How often do you argue with your mother?" And she looked at me kind of funny and I said, "Well, do you argue with your mother?" She said, "Why would I argue with my mother? She gave me the gift of life." That is such an un-American answer to that question. When I talk to American girls, I was at a math and science camp recently and I said, "How many of you are currently fighting with your mothers?" Every hand shoots up. Now, I don't think it's because all those girls are fighting with their mothers necessarily, as much as I think they feel it's socially unacceptable to say that they're not fighting with their mothers. In America today, adolescence is scripted in a way that causes tension between children and parents. Our definitions of adulthood, as seen by teenagers, are all wrong. Adult means rebellious, self-destructive behavior, smoking, drugs, alcohol, and sex. There's a James Dean line where he's asked, "What are you rebelling against?" And he says, "What have you got?" It's a very American attitude for teenagers. Now, there are, of course, bad parents out there, but most parents are more protective of their teenagers than is corporate America. The messages of the mass culture pits teenagers against their parents and their own good sense. Just for example, I heard a story about from a mother, a poor mother actually, about her daughter coming to her and saying, "Mom, I really need some Z Cavaricci jeans." She said, "I know that all jeans are created equal." That's the line I use when I talk to teenagers, all jeans are created equal. "I know that it really doesn't matter whether my jeans are J.C. Penney or Z Cavaricci and that we can't afford designer jeans. But I have to tell you, unless we buy these jeans, I'm going to get teased every day I walk to school." And so the mother took some of the money the family needed for food and ended up buying some designer jeans to spare her daughter that kind of humiliation. Well, that isn't right. That isn't right for that to happen to families in our culture. I want to talk a little bit about pre-adolescent girls. Pre-adolescent girls are almost never in therapy. In fact, when I was writing this book, I was thinking about my therapy clients that were pre-adolescent, and I realized in the 20 years I've been a therapist, I can count the number of girls under 10 I've seen on my 10 fingers. And even girls who have been severely traumatized, who've had a parent suicide, who've been sexually assaulted, are very resilient. They're in therapy a few times and they're back out again, feeling pretty sturdy and whole. And it's like girls this age are zesty, curious, powerful, self-sufficient, bold. Many of the heroines in girls' literature comes from this age group, 6 to 10. I remember myself at that age. I just wanted to do everything. I wanted to be a chemist. I wanted to be an explorer. I decided one summer to read all the books, the children's books in my library, and I did it. My daughter, when she was about 10, there was a whale, Hugo, stuck in San Francisco Bay. Do any of you remember that whale? Well, Sarah was convinced that if we would fly her to the Golden Gate Bridge, she could talk Hugo back into the ocean. That's a very pre-adolescent girl kind of idea. Girls are very zesty and resilient at that age. One of Sarah's friends, Andrea, spent a summer writing a 300-page novel on Billy the Kid that was absolutely horrible, but she had the confidence and energy to do it, which I admired. One of the things that the Gilligan group said about girls this age, which I think is very true, is that it's a kind of a golden opportunity era for girls. They have permission to be tomboys. They can behave in an adaptive manner without regard to whether or not their behavior is masculine or feminine. What happens, it seems like, with adolescence is that permission is withdrawn. Many girls fall apart with junior high. And as I say in the book, as planes and ships go down in the Bermuda Triangle, the selves of many girls go down or disappear in the Bermuda Triangle of adolescence. Fairy tales capture the essence of the changes. Young women eat poisoned apples or prick their fingers with poisoned needles and fall asleep for 100 years. They wander away from home, encounter great dangers, are rescued by princes, and transformed into sexual and docile creatures. With adolescence, girls get a massive dose of femininity training. Girls learn to be what Gloria Steinem called female impersonators. They're pressured to restrict themselves to a narrow band of acceptable thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They sacrifice their wholeness on the altar of social acceptability. There are so many mixed messages to girls. Be independent, but be nice. Be smart, but not so smart you're threatening, and so on. But I'm going to read you a letter from a girl, because I think it's much better to hear this from someone 14, 12 years old than to have me talk about it. One of my favorite things, by the way, about writing this book has been I've gotten literally hundreds of letters from girls, and they're just deeply moving. It's really been a very good experience. This is from Lisa in the Northwest. I've been teased most of the time I have been in junior high for things incredibly superficial to make the teasers feel better about themselves. If you dare to be different, if you do not mold to the common requirements, then the rest of the kids will persecute you until you feel the same way they do. It's like everyone has to feel the same way. All have to suffer. I still do not wear makeup, but since I came into the 7th grade, I have felt my happiness fading away. I notice I cry more easily and am not the fun, intelligent tomboy I can remember. Also, I feel alone. I have to go to the school counselor a lot, and even she cannot say anything to make me feel better. She knows that the situation is hopeless, that we are all doing this to each other. I see myself doing nearly the same things to others as a sort of mental payback to my less popular peers. I try not to, but I feel the need to lash out at the others for the horrible teasing I receive. That's from a 7th grade girl. Now, one of the things that really puzzled me is why are girls in more trouble now? When I was in high school, I wanted to be a forest ranger, and women were not allowed to apply to the Park Service. I also got interested in being a Rhodes Scholar. I thought all of that ivy at Oxford was really romantic. And I rode off to Oxford to find out, how does a person become a Rhodes Scholar? And I got a form letter back saying women cannot apply to be Rhodes Scholars. Now women can be forest rangers, women can be Rhodes Scholars. We've had affirmative action. We've had a strong feminist movement in this country. Why are girls having more trouble now? What I think is happening is that for women like myself, who are extremely lucky, who are fortunate enough to be well-educated, upper middle class, we're having experiences women have never had in the history of the world. But the world from the vantage point of a 7th grade girl doesn't look like the world I'm moving in. She comes of age in a world of Snoop Doggy Dogg, MTV, 400 advertisements a day, Esprit jeans, and so on. And it's a world with a very degrading definition of femininity, one that is even more narrow and restrictive than the one that I came of age with in the 1950s. Junior highs are very mean streets for our daughters these days. And I think college is very tough for young women too. I work at 2 universities in Lincoln, and I see so many college-age women still struggling with the issues that started in early adolescence, struggling with eating disorders, weight and appearance issues, with defining themselves in healthy ways in relationships, with making sense of their sexual behavior, making decisions about what kind of relationships to be in, deciding their attitudes toward alcohol and drugs. By the way, alcohol and drugs are tremendous problems on college campuses. And in my opinion, at least part of the reason for that is that college-age people have a great deal of social anxiety. And that comes from living in such a chaotic culture with so few clear rules about proper behavior. And if you don't have rules and you desperately want to get along, you're anxious. Rules can be very comforting. They can hold our lives in place. Playing without rules is like playing tennis without a net. It's very anxiety-producing over the long haul. I want to talk just a little bit about media. There's very sexist treatment of women in the media. The APA, American Psychological Association, did a study a couple years ago that showed that women are represented in very stereotyped ways. The modal woman on TV is young, beautiful, dependent, passive, and valued for her appearance. Older women, minority women, competent women, and unattractive women are very much underrepresented. There's a great deal of lookism, and by lookism I mean the evaluation of people solely on the basis of their appearance, particularly women. Now, to be fair, lookism does not just come from the media. One of the places lookism comes from is this loss of community. Because when everyone knew everyone, they had so many dimensions on which to evaluate other people. But if you move among strangers, which most of us do, you have only one dimension on which to evaluate people, and that's their appearance. So appearance becomes incredibly important because it's the only social cues we have about most of the people we see. But the media has had a tremendous effect in terms of lookism. I remember when my daughter was in about 7th grade, she was sick, and I decided I'd buy her a magazine to go with her prescription for antibiotics. So I was at our local pharmacy, and I was looking at the teen magazines, and they sickened me. I mean, they were nothing but how to get a boyfriend, cosmetic ads, anorexic models, and I didn't really want her to see that and have that be part of her experience. The average model today is 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighs 111 pounds. The real weight of women and girls is actually increasing since 30 years ago. And what's happened as this disparity between ideal and real gets larger is many more young women have eating disorders. When unnatural is defined as beautiful, young women will do unnatural things in order to be thin. We also objectify and sexualize young women to sell products. And this use of young women's bodies to sell in America has tremendous implications for their physical safety, for their social power, and for their mental health. I'm sure many of you have noticed that ads, fashion, and pornography are increasingly hard to distinguish in America today. Children get in this culture 2 kinds of sex education. They get one from parents and loving grown-ups, and basically, regardless of whether you're a Baptist or a Unitarian, you're likely to tell your 7th grade daughter, if you care about her, don't have sex. Wait till you're older, wait till you can be more responsible, you can make a more mature decision. So loving parents and adults say one thing. Our media tells children something entirely different. In fact, we could not design a worse message about sexuality for children if we tried than the one we're sending them today. Violence, I don't think I need to talk about, except I want to make one point. And that is, I think our messages about violence in this culture are very confusing to young men. I thought about this when, you remember Michael Fay, the vandal, alleged vandal who was going to be caned in Singapore? Well, regardless of whether you think he should have been caned or not, what was interesting to me about that story was that at the same time Michael Fay was in the news, The #1 movie in this country was a movie called The Perfect World, in which a guy shoots his way out of prison with another guy, kills the guy he shot his way out of prison with. He kidnaps a child. He has sort of a joyride across the country, ends up having sex on a table at a restaurant with a waitress, is in a shoot-up with policemen in which the boy's life is in danger, and dies a hero's death. And I thought one of the problems we have with young men in this country is we make being an outlaw very, very masculine and glamorous. And yet when boys act on what we have taught them is cool, we throw them in jail. We do not have a good, consistent message for young men either about how to be in this culture. Sexualized, violent media has very much affected adolescents. There was a poll in 1994 that 54% of all teenagers who'd had sex wished they would have waited. A third of all 8th graders have had sex at this point in time in our country. Now, my values are that intercourse is not healthy for young teenagers. And it's interesting to me that of the teenagers I know and work with, the healthier, more well-adjusted teenagers are really very wary of the sexual chaos they see around them. And actually, they tend to have a pattern of avoiding relationships, not dating in high school, maybe not even dating in college. Lots of young women are defining themselves as bisexuals, I think partly so they don't even have to get near what they perceive as a very dangerous heterosexual universe. And there's a sadness about all this because I don't think children are having the age-appropriate sexual experiences that we could have when we were growing up, because I don't think the boundaries and parameters are in place for them. Teenagers are very confused about how to relate to each other. There's been ample documentation of harassment in the schools. There's always been teasing, but what's different now is the frequency, the age of onset, the graphicness, the viciousness. And one of my experience as a therapist is many more girls are just refusing to go to school. They just will not put up with it, will not go to school, and their parents bring them in as school refusers. Also, my husband, Jim, who's a therapist, has been seeing boys lately who were raised by parents who taught them to be polite and respectful to girls. And so when they're in 7th grade or 8th grade and refuse to tease girls, they get called gay, and they get brought into therapy by parents who are worried about their sadness at being called gay, and they're refusing to go to school sometimes too. You know, in Lincoln we have cotillion classes, which are ballroom dancing classes, which are wildly popular in our town. I mean, hundreds of kids sign up for these, in spite of the fact that I don't think you can go ballroom dancing for 500 miles from Lincoln, as far as I can tell. But I think what's really appealing about these cotillion classes is they're one of the few places in our culture where boys and girls are given some very specific guidance about how to relate to each other politely and properly. And I think they love it. I think they just drink it up and find it extremely comforting. I want to talk a little bit about social changes and so on. My grandfather talks about a town in which people were falling off a cliff, and the city elders got together to decide, should we put a fence at the top of this cliff or an ambulance down in the valley? The work I do as a therapist is ambulance work, and one of the reasons I wrote Reviving Ophelia is I got very tired of fixing people one person at a time. It seemed to me that we really needed to do some fence building. And so I want to talk about that just for a few minutes. Media in this culture, for the most part, is not used in ways that will make our culture better and our citizens happier. Plato has a line that education is teaching our children to find pleasure in the right things. One of the problems we have as a culture is via much of the media and via advertising, we are teaching our children to find pleasure in all the wrong things. We have laws for the pollution of air, for the pollution of water, but not for the pollution of the minds of our children. When we define children as consumers, we hurt them. 8-year-old people are not ready to make decisions about products, oftentimes. One of the problems we have in this country is there are too many adults who are willing to make a living hurting children they do not know. Very few adults will hurt children they know. In fact, I really think that, say, the makers of Mortal Kombat, that's the best-selling video game in the country where the head is pulled off the person and his spinal cord ripped out, part of the game. The makers of that game are probably decent people. They probably coach Little League. I'd probably like them. But they're making a game that's dead wrong for the children of this country. Howard Stern was quoted as saying he would not let his children listen to his show. But all over America, there are children that listen to that show. I used to believe that the best defense against bad ideas is better ideas. But the problem is, too many people make money selling children bad ideas. We must face the hard fact that children are hurt by what they are learning. Now, I'm not recommending censorship, but I am recommending that as adults we have a strong value in this country that it's wrong to do things that hurt children. It's wrong to do work that hurts children. Ibsen defined work as the creation of good on the planet. And I think that's the kind of work we want to encourage our college students to go into. And I think it's the kind of work we want to be doing as adults. There's a beautiful story by Arthur Miller, All My Sons. It's a play about a man who during World War II was making airplane equipment for the war effort. And one of his sons was a pilot over in the Pacific in the war. Anyway, as the war speeded up, he got behind on production, and he started making faulty equipment. And when his son realized that some of his friends were going down in planes that had been outfitted by his father, the son committed suicide by crashing his plane. This play then is about the father's attempt to come to grips with losing this boy. And one of the last scenes in the play, he's talking to his other son, his surviving son, and he says, "You know, I just did it for you and your brother and your mother. I just wanted to do this for my sons, but I guess I realize now they were all my sons." It's a very beautiful line, because I really think what has to happen in this country is we all have to realize that all the children are all our sons and all our daughters. The Seneca tribe had this business of, before a new tool or a new idea was introduced into their culture, they asked, what will this do to the next 7 generations? We're not even asking, what is our technology, what is our media doing to the generation coming up? We live in a very high-tech village, but children have very low-tech needs. They need physical and psychological safety. They need time from adults. They need friends, exercise, play, touch. And I think this is the way that we want to go to make things different for our children. I think there are many things we can do. Families need embedded, once again, in communities. We need new ways for teenagers to acknowledge their growth and development. We need coming-of-age rituals that do not involve alcohol, sex, nicotine, and drugs. For example, one of my friends had a very beautiful coming-of-age ritual for her daughter. This is a single-parent mother. And she wrote all of her women friends and asked them if they would send a quilt piece with some sort of a picture or writing that symbolized their relationship with this daughter. And then all these women got together at a state park in Nebraska, and on a summer weekend. And they had a little ceremony where they explained the meaning of this quilt piece and sewed it together. And then each woman said, "Here is something I will give you to help you grow up. I will help you learn French. I will teach you to write well. I will teach you to drive, and so on. And all of these adults joined around this girl and said, I will help you move into adulthood. A very nice ceremony, I think. We need to, once again in this culture, figure out ways to give children permission to love their parents. And I know that's something that the WILL program works on here with its mother-daughter and father-daughter program. One of the things I think is very important is to have teenagers, and all of us actually, involved in community work. When my daughter was in junior high, she and I went to San Francisco, and there were a lot of homeless people there. And my daughter's very idealistic, and she kept saying, give money to this person, give money to that person. Finally, I said, you know, we can't really keep giving money away or we won't be able to get home. And she was pretty mad about that. So I said, when we get home, we'll do something to help homeless people. We'll do something in a more organized fashion. So we went to work at the homeless shelter in Lincoln. Now, my daughter had four very good effects from that. First of all, she got away from just a poisonous peer culture and was in a place with people of all ages. Secondly, homeless people, amazingly, are the only people in America with plenty of time. And so she was with people who had 5-6 hours to teach her card games, to tell her stories about growing up on a ranch in South Dakota, to put together a crossword or a jigsaw puzzle with her, and so on. And she loved it. She loved these long conversations she had with people from all over the country. Thirdly, the people at the homeless shelter who used chemicals, alcohol and drugs, did not look cool. They looked sick and they looked bad. And it gave her a very bad attitude toward chemicals that she would not have gotten from her peers. And fourthly, it kept her from despair, because doing something to make a difference, getting to work, to serve other people, to make things happen, is a very good antidote to despair. And I think my daughter would have actually been quite depressed if she hadn't had something she could do. One of the things that's been really nice for me as I'm traveling around the country, and I'm hearing everywhere I go lots and lots of stories about what people are doing to help teenagers. You know, the big American stories, the O.J. story, the Oklahoma story, very demoralizing, depressing stories. But the little stories that are cropping up community by community are very hopeful and very energizing. And I wish we had another hour when I could tell you stories and you could tell me stories of what's happening just in your area. There are so many things that people can do to make a difference. I like a quote by C.K. Chesterton: "Courage is the power of being cheerful under circumstances we know to be desperate." I think there are so many things all over America that people can do who care about teenagers. I wrote Reviving Ophelia in the hopes that people will work to change our teen hurting culture. I don't have all the solutions. Answers will come person by person, community by community. I encourage you all to get to work in your community for two reasons. One, maybe you can't change the world, but you can make a difference. And two, you will feel better about yourself. Action is better than passivity. Work is the antidote to hopelessness. And together we can change our culture. Thank you very much. Thank you. It looks like some people need to leave right now and are walking out, but if you can stay a few minutes, we can, I think, take questions or comments or whatever you would like for about 20 minutes. Why don't people walk up to this mic here and speak in it? It's a little bit intimidating, but otherwise I'm afraid nobody will hear you. So please come up here and ask a question if you'd like, or make a comment. Yes, please.
Hi, I would like you to elaborate some on the risk of eating disorders with adolescent girls.
Sure. Okay. Did everyone hear her? Is that mic working well? Well, by the way, both of my books I think are out front or in a room nearby, but my book on eating disorders just was published this summer. It's called Hunger Pains, The American Woman's Tragic Quest for Thinness. And it's a book about my work with eating disorders. In our culture, estimates have run as high as about 1 in 5 young women at college age has an eating disorder. I'm not sure it is quite that high, but it depends on who you talk to in the studies. Eating disorders are rampant in this culture, and they will stay rampant as long as beautiful is defined as impossibly thin, and as long as physical appearance is the #1 determinant of the value of women in our culture. Both of those things at the moment show very little sign of abating. Now, it seems to me one of the problems with eating disorders is they're very expensive, both to the woman that has the eating disorder and to the culture at large, because they tend to really absorb the life of a young woman for years and years and be a real painful and serious problem. I'm sure you have that problem on this campus because college campuses are hotbeds of eating disorders. Yeah, would someone else like to come up, please?
I'm interested to know what you think about and how you feel about the discussion of family values in the political agenda, and specifically whether you feel the welfare reform undertaken in the name of family values will support the kind of family values you spoke about tonight.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm not going to answer it, actually, and I'll tell you why. One of the things I care very much about is being a healer. I think this country is full of people who would divide us on many hot-button issues, whether it's the contract with America or abortion and so on and so on. I never speak to those issues. That doesn't mean I don't have fervently strong opinions, but that's not what I take a public position on. Where I talk is where I think there's an enormous amount of common ground, which is the common ground that most adults in this country want children, I think, to be well-fed, well-educated, and well-behaved. And I think that's very important that we as adults take responsibility for that. You know, there's a great deal of demagoguery, though, now. And I thought about this. My daughter and I got lost in Manhattan. We rented a car in Manhattan, which is a big mistake. And we got lost in the South Bronx, and I started yelling at my daughter. And after we got out of there, which took a while, it took a couple hours, I apologized to her, and I said, you know, I'm sorry I yelled at you. I was scared, I was lost, I didn't know what to do, and I started yelling. And I really think that's a metaphor for what's happening in this country today. People are very, very frightened about their own children, their own families. They're scared, they're confused, and they're yelling at each other. And there are people in this culture who will take advantage of that. Obviously, I want every child in this country to have food, and I would never support any kind of legislation that had children going to bed hungry. Yes.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Sure.
As a college woman, and with a lot of college women in the audience, I wanted to know what you thought we can do to help young women, younger women, and also young men to understand how to relate to each other and to themselves during this time in their lives.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. And I mean, I think you probably could generate as many good answers to that as I could. I know one of the things one of the real problems in this culture is how age segregated we are. You know, old people are with old people, 6-year-olds are with 6-year-olds, 13-year-olds are with 13-year-olds. And whenever we break that age segregation down, things get better. And so one of the real important things I think that college-age people can do is spend time with teenagers, because you are already much wiser than they are about how to relate to your peers, what's important, how to relate to the opposite sex, and so on. So I think it's really good to design any kind of program you can come up with to spend time with either teenage girls, if you're a woman, or to organize. See, one of the problems right now is teenagers tend to have extremely structured settings, like schools, which schools are getting more and more structured. As kids get more and more disruptive, schools get more and more structured. So kids have very structured settings, or they have settings with virtually no structure. And that means they're off with their peers, with no adults helping them interact, with nobody who's wiser, modulating and moderating and supervising and teaching skills and so on. So one way to think about what you can do is create as many medium structure situations as possible for teenagers. And this could be having poetry readings, having a coffee house where any place where drugs, alcohol, guns, swearing, and so on are not welcome. Places where they can go and with some adult supervision, learn to interact properly with each other. There's some wonderful programs around, like for example, one program I really like is a program in Yellow Springs, Ohio called the Environmental Mentor Program. And in that program, older people are paired up with young people, and they take them around the town and they show them where everything used to be. You know, they go where that bank is, that used to be our country school. That river used to be twice as broad. That field over there used to be, you know, natural prairie or whatever. So kids are learning about what the town used to be like. Old people and kids are connecting up. Older people are learning that many of the resources they had no longer exist. That's a nice program. Another program I like is in Norfolk, Nebraska, where a teacher started random acts of kindness and senseless beauty. Probably some of you have seen that bumper sticker. Anyway, she started giving fifth graders awards for doing a random act of kindness or senseless beauty. And pretty soon other kids wanted awards for that. And pretty soon the whole darn town wanted to have. The newspaper started printing interesting acts. And when I was in Norfolk to give my speech, it was just hilarious because you could hardly carry your own groceries across the street. I mean, people were just totally into who could do the most for each other. So I think mentorship programs are really good. I think programs that get people from what Martin Buber called I-it relationships, where they're relating to each other as objects, to I-thou relationships, where they're relating to people as complex and interesting human beings, are really important. There was a group of young women in Topeka that formed a club called Fearless in their high school. They were at a very tough inner city high school. And they put together a media show, and they went around and talked to the kids in their school about sexual assault, sexual harassment, self-defense, racism, and so on. And that group of young women was very empowered. And I think college-age women could really go out to the schools and help get some of those kinds of things started. You know, the interesting thing is there's 100 things to do. It just takes a little bit of energy, really, to get started and a little bit of faith in yourself. So if you have that energy, I would say, think of whatever sounds interesting to you and begin. How about a couple more questions? Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering what you thought about the influence of single-sex education on adolescent girls.
Yeah. You know, since I've written this book, I've done a lot of speaking at young women's schools, private schools, all over the country, and I think they're great. I mean, my experience of all the schools I've been at is the young women were confident, assertive, really feeling great about their education. In fact, I spoke at Miss Porter's school, which is where Jacqueline Kennedy went to school in Connecticut. And after I got through speaking, I had a line of girls, probably as, you know, to the back of this room, that came up to me one at a time, and it was almost like they were making testimonials. They said one after another, I was miserable at my school, and until I came to Miss Porter's, I was really worried about myself. I was miserable, I was unhappy. Now that I'm here, I feel really good. You know, I feel like I'm being accepted for who I am, and I'm learning and I'm growing, and so on and so on. So it's hard not to be positive about girls' schools. I think they're great for the girls who are fortunate enough to go to them. I think really a lot of wonderful people are involved in women's education in this culture. On the other hand, they are not a solution to a very serious cultural problem, which is, at the present time, we are not educating young men and young women to get along with each other. We are setting them up for misunderstandings, collisions, and very, very serious problems. And we see it from fourth grade, when the harassment begins. We see it with sexual assaults and date rapes in high school and college and beyond. We see it with broken marriages where men and women cannot communicate and do not respect each other. And so I think we have a very serious cultural problem to address. Children, particularly at this point in time, desperately need adult guidance on how to treat the opposite sex properly and respectfully. One of the things that I think is very scary to girls in girls' schools often is what's it going to be like when they hit the co-ed world. And I think oftentimes it is very scary for them. It's also scary for young women who've been going to co-ed schools all the way. Yes, any more questions? Well, it's a work night and it's rainy, and my guess is you all want to go home and put on your sweats and maybe watch a little TV. Thank you very much for coming out.
On behalf of all of the sponsors, I would again like to thank Dr. Pipher for this evening's lecture. Also, I would like to let you know that both of Dr. Pipher's books are on sale right now in the Science Building Auditorium, which is to your left as you leave the building. Also, Dr. Pipher will be returning to Richmond on Saturday, March 22nd as keynote speaker and panelist for St. Catherine's Symposium entitled Empowering Girls, Strategies for Parents and Teachers. March 2nd, sorry, March 2nd. And if you have any further questions, please call St. Catherine's School for additional information. Again, thank you and have a good night.